Welcome to this video from a collaboratory of 23 synergy circles of the evolutionary leaders. Initiated just this year, 2023, for the evolutionary leaders and its 23 areas of activist engagement, and centering on issues of the divine feminine, divine child, and women's and children's issues around the world. I'm Dr. Kurt Johnson, coordinator of the Synergy Circles, and I'll be joined in these initial videos by collaboratory founders and prominent leaders and activists, Denise Scotto JD, Laura George JD, and Dr. Jude Curavan, along with Riane Eisler JD, renowned author on these global issues. All of them working together, along with others, on this emerging activist collaboratory of the Evolutionary Leaders Circle, a project of the Source of Synergy Foundation. In these initial discussions, they will lay out much of the landscape for these important areas of global engagement based on Dr. Eisler's famous 4 cornerstones of how our world can move from dominance consciousness and dominance cultures to partnership consciousness and partnership cultures. In each video, we'll begin by introducing Dr. Eisler and the 4 cornerstones, and then the featured guest for the episode. Riane Eisler JD, PhD, is a best-selling author, systems scientist, futurist, cultural historian, and attorney, whose work shows how to build a more equitable, sustainable, and less violent world. Her famous book, The Chalice and the Blade, Our History, Our Future, is now in 57 US printings and 30 foreign editions. Dr. Eisler is president of the Center for Partnership Systems, CPS, and editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies at the University of Minnesota. She is also the author of Nurturing Our Humanity, How Domination and Partnership Structure Our Brains, Lives, and Future, co-authored with anthropologist Dr. Douglas Fry, Oxford University Press, 2019, and The Real Wealth of Nations, Creating a Caring Economics, hailed by Nobel Peace Laureate Archbishop Desmond Tutu as the template for the better world that we are so urgently seeking. In short, according to dictionaries, a domination hierarchy is a social hierarchy arising when interaction of members of a social system creates a ranking system. Such rankings of who are favored can involve gender, race, economic status, and so on. Dr. Eisler's 4 cornerstones of how we shift from domination consciousness to partnership consciousness are these, and we invite you to hear our first video with Dr. Eisler in which she elaborates these 4 elements. The first cornerstone is childhood. The second cornerstone is the attitude toward gender. The third cornerstone is economics, and the 4th cornerstone is story and language. So let's go over now to introduce our guest for this episode. The guest for this discussion is Denise Scotto JD. Denise Scotto Esquire's advocacy and influence on human rights on a global stage is exhaustive. In addition to being invited by the Taiwanese government to help establish that country's first CEDAW laws, she worked with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative in South Africa during the first post-apartheid years, serving as a key partner with the NGO Coalition for the International Criminal Court, and spearheaded the first legal education program in New York City and New York State, bringing awareness to the pressing global issue of human trafficking at a local level. A United Nations staff member at its New York headquarters, Denise helped formulate new policy related to good governance, human rights norms and mechanisms, Security Council resolutions, and inclusive and sustainable development. She has always been a voice for the innocent, the oppressed, for the rights of women, children, persons of disabilities, and for the realization of world peace. Denise is an attorney at law, an international policy advisor, public speaker, interfaith minister, and a founding chair of a variety of international committees, most recently the International Day of Yoga Committee at the United Nations, where she combines her international advocacy with her decades-long practices of meditation and personal connection to diverse yoga masters and spiritual leaders. She joins Laura George as a founding admin of the Evolutionary Leaders Synergy Circles Collaboratory, bringing you these video discussions. So over now to Denise Scotto and Riane Eisler. So welcome Riane Eisler and Denise Scotto, who we've just told you so much about. I'll be passing the baton now to them, and Denise will be initiating the discussion. I'll then be joining you again at the end. So over now to Riane Eisler and Denise Scotto.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kurt Johnson. We appreciate you being here and giving us such kind introductions this evening. It's my great pleasure to be here with Dr. Riane Eisler. Many of you have heard her on this series and have heard the different kinds of perspectives that she shared with her guests. I'm deeply delighted today to be with her. And one of the things I'd like to share with everyone is that her work was so formative with me when I was a young attorney, specifically working in the United Nations. Riane is such a pioneer in laying down so much, not just about the law, which we share as legal professionals, but from an economic, from a social, from a cultural perspective, and dare I even say, from a spiritual perspective, because her work has been about evolving human consciousness and our humanity. So I am so delighted, Riane, that we actually have this time together. And as I had said briefly to you on our comments off air, you know, the work that you've done really did inform a lot and helped me when I was doing advocacy in my work as a UN staff person. So many of us are indebted to you from the law, but just in terms of international change and trying to create a better world. And I think that your cornerstones that you have are things that we'll talk about today because they're so interconnected. You know, there may be these 4 bullet points, but at the same time, everything affects everything, as you know well. So I'd like to start maybe on the topic of and the cornerstone of gender and how women are treated around the world in terms of parity. And what you see is the biggest challenge for women to take their rightful place with men in society. And however you'd like to answer that, I know that will be something that we'll all be very interested in hearing.
Well, it's really a pleasure for me, Denise, to be with you, and I am honored and delighted by what you're saying about the reach of my work. And I thank you so much for mentioning that. As you know, my research has really identified a new way of looking at the world. And it's a way that goes beyond the conventional way that we've inherited from what I call more rigid domination times. The struggle between right-left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, which I really think are distractions. For one thing, none of these are, I mean, it's so obvious in a sense, they marginalize or ignore nothing less than the majority of humanity, women and children. But even beyond that, none of them, I mean, there have been repressive, regressive, violent regimes in every one of these conventional categories. So really, what are we fighting about? It's a way of fragmenting us against one another and are really fragmenting our consciousness, whereas the configurations of the partnership and domination systems and the lens of the partnership domination biocultural scale is a way of seeing patterns, of seeing configurations that repeat themselves in all these kinds of societies. And yes, gender is a major part of the configuration, not women against men or men against women, not the gender stereotypes, which are really part, these rigid gender stereotypes are needed, and we've inherited them from more rigid domination times, ranking one over the other, the so-called masculine over the so-called feminine, which is a way of equating difference with superiority and inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. And you see that in Nazi Germany, in Khomeini's Iran, in the Taliban, in Putin's Russia today. It doesn't really matter. There's a connection between that. So from my perspective, gender is not just a, quote, women's issue or just a, quote, men's issue. It's a primary social and economic organizing principle in which anything coded feminine, like caring, caregiving, nonviolence, is considered inferior, is considered ancillary at best to anything considered rigid in these rigid gender stereotypes that are characteristic of domination systems to be masculine. And again, I want to emphasize this is not something inherent in either women or men. My late husband was a very caring man. Kurt Johnson is a very caring man. And we all know women who have really internalized this gendered system of values to the extent that they call men who are more caring sissies, weak sisters, right? So to answer your question, if we look at societies that have today moved more to the partnership side of this partnership domination scale, societies like Finland, like Sweden, like Norway, like Denmark, these societies have a very important way of looking at gender, which has not been really emphasized, which is that, yes, women are about 40 to 50% of the national parliament, right, in the leadership. But as the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their, quote, masculinity to also embrace the kinds of values that are coded feminine. So these societies have a lot of caring policies, very generous paid parental leave for both fathers and mothers, very accessible and well-paid child care and education. I mean, in Finland, which always ranks first in educational international analyses, becoming a teacher is a goal and it's well paid. And it's not that they're socialist, they are, but they often call themselves more caring societies. And it's not just that they're small and relatively homogeneous. There are a lot of relatively small and homogeneous societies that, boy, are they domination oriented. So Einstein said it, and I'm going to stop with this. You can't solve problems with the same thinking, with the same consciousness that created them. So here is a new way of looking at things. And once we do that, some of the actions really become evident, and both gender and childhood not no longer marginalized as they are in conventional thinking. And with it, we also take into account families.
Well, you've given a very comprehensive answer to that question, Riane, and it brings up quite a few different things that I'd like to unpack a bit more. You talked a lot about seeing women and youngsters from a more caring vantage point, and how that translates into concrete policies, which you talked about with regard to having policies for both men and women that are more family friendly. And I think one of the game changers for me that I've worked on and that I advocated for and continue to advocate for, you brought up to my consciousness years and years ago, was how women's unpaid work, their caring work, caring for youngsters, caring for older people, just in general, what they do, cooking and cleaning and washing and shopping, and, it goes on and on and on, how that is not factored into the GDP. And if we think about those women's contributions into the GDP, wouldn't that in and of itself be such a huge game changer across the world to begin with? So I bring that back into your lap now, if I may.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right that, in fact, there was a study in Australia that showed that if the caring work, and it's mostly work done by women in families, were included, it would constitute about 50% of the reported GDP. So we're not talking about, and that's just in families. It doesn't include caring for nature. It doesn't include caring for others in the community. But I really think we need to understand our history. And this is where this multidisciplinary approach, rather than the siloed approach of the academy, is so helpful. Because if you look at where we inherited both capitalism and socialism, we have to go back to the 1700s and the 1800s, very early industrial times. And we're today in the 21st century post-industrial knowledge service era. Okay? So on that ground alone, these old operating systems would be antiquated. But there's something else. Both of these systems, both Smith, the father of capitalism, and Marx, the father of socialism, came out of more domination-oriented times. In fact, they are really, GDP reflects what both capitalism and socialism include and exclude as, quote, productive work. Because for both Marx and for Smith, the work of caring for people, starting at birth in families, was to be performed for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. Therefore, it was termed by them just reproductive rather than productive work. And if we are to change this, which we must, And we have at the Center for Partnership Systems been really trying to work on an alternative way of measuring what is and is not productive work. Okay? The social wealth economic indicators. And perhaps we have time, I'll get back to them. But we have to factor in the three life-sustaining sectors that are left out of both capitalist and socialist theory and practice as reflected in GDP, which is the natural economic sector, the volunteer community economic sector, and the household economic sector. And really leave behind this spurious, this terrible distinction between, quote, productive, which is a joke, frankly. I mean, GDP considers selling cigarettes or selling fast foods and the resulting funeral bills and the resulting medical bills, they're all great for GDP. Natural disasters, great for GDP. Climate change, great for GDP. I mean, this is insane, really. We really have to stop teaching that spurious distinction in our economic schools, in our business schools. And that is something that immediately begins to involve both women and men, because there are two basic forms of humanity. Of course, we're today realizing that this gender binary way, it's a functional elimination system. You're either the in-group or you're the out-group, starting with the in-group of mankind and the female other.
Well, I think that slowly things are changing in business schools, but I agree with you. I think that it's about a revolution in consciousness, because for us to value people becoming sick and helping people who are at the bottom of the barrel because of a natural disaster and thinking that that is a positive thing, that shows how our values are really, I think, warped and out of context with what is healthy, what is life affirming, what really is about having positive experiences for people to be able to grow and develop to their full capacity. So I think that this is about a real different change in mindset. And I have seen it slowly starting to happen with one or two courses, being offered at some of these schools. But, it goes beyond that. And I want to just get back to what you said about labeling things, productive and reproductive, because at this particular time in the United States, we know that there's a real backlash against women's issues, particularly with regard to reproductive rights and reproductive health and treatments. And we know that there was a recent U.S. Supreme Court decision which really sort of did away with what we had as seminal precedent, Roe v. Wade. So now there's, I think, a lot going on in the courts about what is possible. Do women have a right to choose to have an abortion? Do women have a right to choose certain kinds of health treatments and health care? So I see that we're having sort of a new way of looking at this. Sure, there's a lot that's very negative impinging upon individual women, and I would even say girls. And at the same time, I see that there's really a lot of awareness being brought up to maybe a new generation of women and girls and men and boys about the issue of reproductive rights, about abortion, about family planning even, and what that means, and the responsibility of men and boys bringing, a child into this world at this particular time. So I I know it's very controversial to say it, but I'm of the belief that, if we can shine light on it and have informed discussion, then it's the opportunity for us to really move forward in positive ways. So this was unexpected in terms of what I originally thought I'd ask you, but I don't know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on it.
Well, look, I think that you're absolutely right, of course, that there is what you call a backlash. But that backlash against women is really part of a larger regressive movement towards the domination side. It's not coincidental, for example, that when Stalin came to power, abortion became heavily penalized. These are not coincidences. The fact that the Taliban see the suppression of even education for women, it wasn't just Stalin. The Taliban see keeping women even from education and under strict male control. And here in the United States are these people who keep talking about not having government control. I mean, it's a joke. And then they want to control nothing less than what happens in a woman's body. This is part of the regression to domination. And when I talk, I often speak of these four cornerstones of family and childhood, of gender, of economics, and of story and language, because these are really relational dynamics that are very different depending on the degree of orientation to either side of the partnership domination social scale. And what we're talking about is something fundamental, which is control over women. And it's not coincidental that in the name of, quote, spirituality, they keep talking about the sanctity of life. But somehow it's only life before we're born and after we die. In between, don't bother me with this, because that's where the in-group versus out-group thing comes in. Only for the in-group am I interested in, taking care of our community, etc., but not for the out group. So we're really talking about something that we have to look at the larger context. Putin in 2018, he was instrumental in drastically lowering the penalty for family violence. So if you hurt or kill a stranger, the penalty is much greater than if you hurt a woman, a child, a man in the family. Why? Because these people who are part of the regression to strongman rule, to a very binary gender stereotypes, and you better not deviate or else, to the really to ranking the so-called masculine and men over the so-called feminine and women. These people have a very coherent approach, and he realizes that there is a connection between a male-dominated, rigidly authoritarian, and yes, violent and highly punitive family, and an authoritarian, strongman, punitive, violent state. We've got to see this, because if we don't see it, the beginning of change is a change in consciousness. Then the actions follow.
You anticipated what I was going to bring up. I was going to bring up the aspect of violence against women, and because you spoke a lot about the regressive regimes and Afghanistan in particular, I just like to say that for many people who may not be aware, Afghanistan right now is a situation, as you alluded to. Youngsters, girls, are not even allowed to leave the home any longer. Initially, it was that they could go to school and that they could work, and then it slowly started to chip away, that only an education up to sixth grade was possible. But in this short amount of time, in 2 years since the Taliban retook control in August of 2021, it seems now the stories that are coming out of Afghanistan is that there's really one of gender apartheid. That's what many of the advocates are calling it, gender apartheid, because women are not allowed to work outside the home. They're not allowed to go out without an escort, and there has to be a particular reason to go out, which is approved by the man. So you're right, they're not engaging in any kind of public life whatsoever. And in terms of the private sphere, I think that it is far beyond what Putin did. It's, well, anything is acceptable in the home because that, again, is something that, is so insulated from any kind of responsibility or any kind of accountability. So anything could go on in these repressive regimes when it talks about women and girls, and as you said, the minority of our humanity. I just wanted to bring that up because I don't know how well many people are following the international politic. And it's such an extreme example, which I think is something that we do need to be alarmed about and concerned about, because what affects someone, even if it's across the world, affects all of us, affects all of our humanity. Um, I think that law is an important tool for change, but as we know, I mean, this is lawlessness, and law is used really as a tool to help people not have accountability and to only help themselves and not honor the dignity of humanity, the dignity of each and every person. So what you talk about, I think, is something that really brings up a lot in terms of the law, the use of the law, warning signs to look for in terms of uh, repression and repressive regimes.
Well, I think I mentioned to you that I wrote a piece called Protecting the Majority of Humanity. And I think that what's happening under the Taliban should be immediately, it falls directly under the purview of the Rome Statute of Crimes Against Humanity. The problem is that women, gender, and childhood are not protected categories. And in this article, I'm not surprised that they're not, frankly, because we've inherited this. I mean, look at right versus left. Where are the women? Look at capitalist versus socialist. Where are the women? Look at all of our conventional categories and look at our education. My goodness, I mean, out of what is it, about 700 years of so-called modern science, modern education, which, by the way, started in a clerical, misogynist, all-male, there's a historian of science, David Noble, and he wrote a book about that called A World Without Women. And I would add to it, A World Without Children. Okay, so here we are again, marginalizing the majority of humanity. But the point of it is, out of these 600-700 years, we didn't even get gender studies, women's studies, men's studies until about 60 years ago. And even then, they are marginalized, they are siloed, they're not obligatory, they're not part of the general curriculum of the canon. And this is unacceptable. I mean, and of course, some of the gender studies are being co-opted like crazy. You know, first it was there is no such category as woman. Remember when the flavor of the month was deconstructionism, and now we're questioning gender. Well, of course, there are two basic forms of humanity, and the gender fluidity doesn't change that. I mean, the fact that there are people in between, or people who want to switch from one to the other, or there are people of a different sexual orientation than, you know, the one that is canonized really in domination systems, that has nothing to do with it. These are all characteristics of domination systems. And I have to add that, as you know, in my book, The Chalice and the Blade, which, by the way, is now in, I think, 57 US printings and something like about almost 30 foreign editions, I really, really bring this out, that we absolutely need a new way of looking at the world that considers, as I said, and will repeat again, gender as a primary social and economic organizing principle. And I say economic because of what I said earlier, that we have inherited economic systems in which, again, the so-called women's work of caring, which affects women, men, everyone in between, and children of any gender, is marginalized. And this is crazy.
It really is absurd. And I just want to say, for those who may not know what the Rome Statute is, this is the authority that gives rise to the International Criminal Court, which is based in The Hague, and really prosecutes, or has the ability to prosecute, people for war crimes and crimes against humanity, including genocide, where states are unwilling or unable to do so. This is something that is so close to my heart because, as I had told Riane before we started, I actually came to the international work and understanding of international law in a completely different way from the genocide going on in Rwanda, and how that was just killing my heart to see how these women were just being treated. And as a result of organizing programs through one of the bar associations in New York, I then became an NGO delegate to the PrepComs for the ICC, as we call it, International Criminal Court. So there's a lot that Riane and I share about this. And I think the next thing that we share, I'm going to bring up, is the United Nations, because I was a staff person working in the UN for several years in New York headquarters. And I remember Riane at the UN at least on two occasions. I remember once she was presenting before the UNGA, but then I remember another time, this was before the Capital Master Plan, and the rooms are very different now. But conference room 1 or 2 was huge. It was so huge, and they had a big gallery in the back. And Riane was up at the dais presenting on her book, The Chalice and the Blade. It was such a packed room. There was such enthusiasm, such excitement. People were so inspired and rushing up to her right afterwards. So I'd like to ask you, Riane, when we talk about the UN from an organizing perspective, from an organization that gives so much structure around the world to so many, but also to so much, how do you see the UN in terms of the way for the future? We know that the UN needs change. We know the way it is not sustainable. It's sustainable for only how many countries? We could count it on one hand, really. And I would say it's not even sustainable for that. But, just asking you, from your background and your experience, what do you see in terms of the possibility for transformation with the UN?
Well, I would so really like to have the UN understand what we've been talking about and really understand these 4 cornerstones. Not because, as you say, the UN has that much power, because it really doesn't. but it does have some authority, and it does have a reach. And I think that trainings, for example, on the four cornerstones, on these four relational dynamics, could go a very long way towards transforming the United Nations, because you have already the capacity there of people to really look at childhood. I mean, there's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Oh, how I wish that that could be, and it's not coincidental that it has either not been adopted, or if it is adopted, it's been marginalized or just plain ignored, really. And the same thing with the Convention on, on women. But we have all been taught to marginalize this, especially those of us with a quote higher education. And I can't emphasize this sadly enough. What the UN needs is internal training in a new paradigm.
Well, I want to thank you for bringing up the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the CRC, and the Convention to Eliminate All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, which is known as CEDAW, the International Bill of Rights for Women. It's what you said. We have some really strong law out there, and we have some member states, actually a lot of member states, who have adopted, ratified this, and even have created enabling legislation or harmonized their domestic law with this. And at the same time, they have all these reservations. They go down the provisions and say, no, I'm reserving. That means that we're not being bound by this. We're not being bound by that. That's sad. It really is sad in a way. And I, at the same time, have heard from so many people around the world, particularly women, because at one point in time I was servicing the committee of experts for the CEDAW committee when it was based in New York. I heard so many women come up to me and say, if it weren't for the UN, I don't know what my country would be like. I don't know what my situation would be like. It's bad now, but we have some sort of obligation because they have to come and they have to give this report, and I was able to get some funding from this organization to really say what's going on in the ground with this, kind of thing. So it gets back to what you said. The UN may not have a lot of power, but you said it has authority and reach. And I believe it really does. And it does inspire so many people. So many people who are ordinary citizens, I think, still feel that the UN can have an important influence in their country, and that these sustainable development goals, the SDGs, are an attempt for everybody, to really have some sort of progress, so to speak, But being inside the UN, I think that you're right. We do need to have more internal training and really think about other people in many ways as ourselves, because when you're working in the UN from a different country and you're stationed at headquarters in New York or even in Geneva, those are primary posts that people in your home country look up to you, and you have so much clout and you have so much influence and your reputation is enhanced, and you have so many benefits that maybe you would not have had in terms of your youngsters going to certain schools and your families being eligible for X, Y, and Z and stuff like that. So I think training is a very good first start. And I would hope that that would allow for more awareness to come into it.
Well, I think that it certainly is an important step. For example, the United Nations is now working on a kind of a dashboard of new metrics. And I know that they're very general, and that, again, women and children and families are really, it's still working within the conventional frame. And that frame, by the way, is fraying not just at the edges, but throughout. It's simply not working. There's climate change, there's AI, and there's GBT box, and it's a whole new world. And if we are going to really solve the challenges that we have, I mean, I'm always back to Einstein because, I mean, he understood that you cannot solve problems with the same consciousness that created them. And this goes to our social categories, to our language. I mean, I had to introduce new language like hierarchies of actualization as against hierarchies of domination. Why? There were no words. There are no words. I mean, yes, we have a new word, empowering, which is a part of the reflects the trend towards in the partnership direction. Transparency. I mean, transparency in the domination system. I mean, come on, let's not be ridiculous here. But it's all piecemeal, whereas the people pushing us back have a coordinated frame. I mean, they really see that there's a connection between families, big time, and we know from neuroscience, for goodness sakes. I mean, this is not some esoteric knowledge. This is mainstream science, that the whole argument between nature and nurture, again, is a distraction, a red herring, because actually what counts is gene expression. And that happens when our brains, which are still not fully formed at birth, interact with our environments, which for humans are primarily cultural and are very, very different depending on the degree of orientation of our institutions, our families, our education, our religion, our politics, our economics, our technology, to either end of the partnership domination scale. So I believe that we need new tools very badly, new metrics, but trying to fit these metrics into the old paradigm is a big mistake, because it still marginalizes, somewhere only one of the 7 SDGs,
yeah.
Yes, SDGs is gender, whereas we have what I call a gendered system of values, in which there's always money for what is stereotypically associated in domination system with the masculine, like money for prisons. Well, who's that? That's the domination system's male head of household. Or for the hero as killer, armaments, weapons, wars, but somehow there isn't enough money for what is foundational, especially in our post-industrial knowledge service age, which is capacity development. I mean, economists who live in some alternative reality keep telling us something that happens to be true, that our most important, what they like to call human capital is, quote, human capital. I prefer to call it capacity development, because I don't like the commodification of human capital, but it doesn't matter. Whatever you call it, we know that whether or not we have these resilient, creative, flexible, caring people who don't just know how to give or take orders, but to really develop answers to problems, largely hinges on the care and education children receive, especially in their first 5 years. Where is that in this dashboard? Tucked away someplace. Where is intra-household economic distribution? It doesn't exist in that paradigm, because all we care about is what happens outside the household. I mean, this is tunnel vision, but it's the old paradigm.
I was going to say, and it's bad television, but I know what you're saying. In terms of you creating new language, I'm sure that you have a lot of tools which would be useful for many people. Would you like to take a moment to maybe share with us some of the tools that you have that if we're interested in learning more, we can go to and learn about?
Absolutely. And thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Denise. First of all, we have an online course called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. Remember that I said that there are these 4 relational dynamics, these 4 cornerstones, and one of them, of course, is story and language. So we have a course called Changing Our Story, Changing Our Lives. And it happens to be on a summer sale for $50 only, which is amazing. So please take that course. It has 4 videos. It has all kinds of resources. Secondly, and we're looking for funding to really translate what were originally 52 indicators, which is far too many, okay, into a kind of an index. I don't know what direction that will take, but we need funding for really ensuring not only that we can do what we have set out to do, which is to show the economic value of the work of caring for people starting at birth and the work of caring for our natural life support systems. You know, not in neither capitalism or in socialist theory is there anything about caring for nature. For both Smith and Marx, nature is just there to be exploited. So we're trying to add on to fundamentally imbalanced systems, as I said, when I spoke to the General Assembly of the United Nations. People get excited about this, but what happens then is that they're brought back into their old thinking. And so we really need a movement at this point, a partnership movement. And one of the tools that we have for that is a self-assessment tool, because believe me, it's not the people pushing us back only, it's all of us that have been conditioned. So it's a partnership technology toolkit, first of all, that was funded by the Ford Foundation, but it needs work. And we will have a new iteration as a self-assessment and a group assessment tool within the next months, I think. And this, I think, could be wonderful for the UN, come to think of it. If it were used by the United Nations to really examine what we hold to be reality, quote, because it isn't just the people who are in denial, you know, climate change denial, election result denial, COVID-19 denial, denial, period. Which in my latest book, by the way, Nurturing Our Humanity, I explain the dynamics of that and how it really starts in domination-oriented families, okay? But I won't go into that. So that is one of the tools we have. We have a ton of resources, statistical data, and we have wonderful graphics that show the configuration of the partnership system and the nomination system that describe the 4 cornerstones or the 4 relational dynamics. I have a great deal of confidence in the human nature that we hear so much about as, you know, original sin is bad, Say if it's genes, it's bad. You know, why they fight each other is beyond me, because it's the same story, right? We're bad. We have to be, hence, rigidly controlled from the top down, you know, starting with God fearing. I mean, it's really quite simple, isn't it? And you mentioned the spiritual element. To me, spirituality is putting love into action.
That's a beautiful quote that you just used. And I believe that so many others who were thought leaders and ahead of their time also used that too. I know Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, is someone who immediately comes to mind, be the change you wish to see in the world, and how that his heart was just so open, and he really practiced every day and every moment those values of having that open heart of care and kindness and compassion. And we know Bishop Desmond Tutu with the forgiveness that he had, and that level of really deep, authentic forgiveness that he had for so many in South Africa and so many other places around the world. Really just cry out to me now when you said that. Um, I
I love
just
it.
want to ask one more thing because you didn't give us your website. So where are we going to
Oh
go to
my
find
goodness.
this? We need the website. Where should
I
we go to
certainly
look?
will give it to you, but you mentioned Desmond Tutu, and I've mentioned two of my books, The Chalice and the Blade and Nurturing Our Humanity, which, by the way, came out with Oxford University Press in 2019. But the books that Desmond Tutu gave a wonderful comment for is my book on economics, and I highly, highly recommend it. It's called The Real Wealth of Nations. It's a play on Smith, you know, on the
Yeah.
wealth of nations. But what Tutu had to say is that it's a template for the better world we have been so urgently seeking. And I really urge everyone to read it because it is so applicable. And the subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics. And it calls for a caring revolution, not an armed revolution, but a caring revolution. The website is, well, I'll give you two websites. One is centerforpartnership.org, and there you can get the course, and I urge everyone to enroll in it because it's a really good way of jumping in. And the feedback that I get, by the way, from people about all of this is, gee, this all makes sense out of so many things that didn't make sense otherwise. And that is, keep that in mind. The other website is my own website. It hasn't been taken care of that much, but it's RianeEisler.com with two E's in the middle. So thank you. And thank you so much. It's been just an absolute pleasure talking with you. And yes, I think that we see a battle now, really, and that's what it is. But it's not between right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist. It's between those who want to drag us back to more rigid domination times in every one of these categories, and those of us who want a better world, which is the world described by the partnership rather than the domination model.
Well, it's been a real treat for me to speak with you. And also, to just give a little plug for the Synergy Circle that I'm involved in with Laura George and Dr. Kurt Johnson, because the focus is really about the feminine force and understanding the value of the heart, and of love is what you just talked about, and that caring and that kindness and what that means in the world. What is the divine feminine? How is that in the world? Can men embrace the divine feminine? What does that mean for men too? So I think that it's been very helpful to speak with you so that we can go through some more practical means to really have a better understanding to, talk in a more informed way about feminism and the feminine force and what it means when we talk about structures and the organizing that we have now through law, through business, through economics, and how our cultures have really been with us for such a long time, and science has been with us for such a long time, that we need to be updated on the new science and really have that inform us as we move forward to advance human consciousness. I want to thank you so much, Riane, for your dedication all these years to creating, I think, a more peaceful, a more loving, more caring society for not only men and women and our children, but our precious, precious, beautiful planet and, all of our sentient beings, our animals, and all of our plants and all of our wildlife. So thank you so much. It's been a real joy for me, and I hope that we can continue with this series and learn a lot more.
Well, thank you. I really think that working together, we can make a difference, all of us.
And I think that's the beauty of so many of us involved in the Synergy Circles, because we're here to support one another. We're here to amplify each other's message and to see where we can be of mutual benefit and to see how we can really create more light and more love in the world. And speaking of light and love in the world, one of the persons who's holding so much with this and who's doing this with a smile on his face is Dr. Kurt Johnson, and we really have him here helping us, supporting us, and just want to give Kurt a thank you too. So why don't we invite Kurt Johnson back in with us right now? Over to you, Dr. Kurt Johnson.
Well, thank you so much, Riane Eisler and Denise Scotto, for joining us in this conversation about the foundational questions of our time, and this, which is the 9th episode of the series. And please also enjoy the discussion on similar issues that Riane just had with Laura George of the Oracle Institute, which is episode 8 of the foundational questions of our time. And actually, these 2 new videos with Laura, Riane, and Denise will be actually co-sponsored by the new collaboratory of Synergy Circles on the Divine Feminine, Divine Child, and Women's Issues, which is actually a collaboratory of 23 Synergy Circles across 23 thematic areas, all agreeing on the importance of this theme. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you, Denise, so very much.
Thank you so much for joining us in these video discussions of the Synergy Circles Collaboratory of the Evolutionary Leaders, a project of the Source of Synergy Foundation. In this collaboratory, 23 activist circles across diverse areas of activist engagement bring you important discussions on the topics portrayed in the banners of this series and the discussions that you have just heard from prominent global thought leaders. So crucially needed if our world is to move from dominance consciousness and dominance cultures to partnership consciousness and partnership cultures. You can learn more at evolutionaryleaders.net/synergy circles, where you'll find out more also about our Igniting the Holo movement. That's HOLO movement.net, and at all the other links that follow in the credits directly hereafter. Thank you for joining us in this era of emerging networks of networks, so desperately needed for our achievement of a world that works for all.